Buenas noches. Good evening. My name is Cristian Doña, and I'm the director of the Office for Latino and Latin American Studies. And we're really happy to bring our charlas to the community, right? And in partnership with Boys Town. Today they're going to talk about family separations, a very, very important topic. And I would like to introduce the three faculty members, the OLLAS faculty members that did this research, and they're going to talk today. Dr. Juan Casas is an associate professor of psychology and director of the Psych Graduate Program. He's also associate director of OLLAS, the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. And his research is on relational aggression and victimization, peer relations, and friendship. Dr. Jonathan Santo is also associate professor of psychology and affiliated faculty of OLLAS. His research is on adolescent identity development, moderator of the depressive effects of peer victimization, cross-cultural differences in peer relations. And Dr. Lissette Aliaga-Linares, she's assistant professor of sociology and of Latino and Latin American studies, or part of OLLAS. Her main research is on, urban poverty, segregation, migration, and informal economies in Latin America and the United States. And she is engaged in a number of community-based projects in Nebraska and active member of the Women in the Informal Economy, an international organization that focuses on promoting informal workers' rights around the world. So, thank you.
Thanks. We haven't done anything yet. No, again, we really do appreciate both your time and your willingness to come out on a night like this. We really want to keep this somewhat informal. So if you run out of coffee, you want some more pan dulce, feel free to get up in the middle of the talk and refill your beverage, grab another piece of bread. But what we're hoping today is to tell you a little bit about what the science has to say with respect to these family separations that have been in the news. I'm sure everybody in this room has read some of the coverage in the media. So what we want to do is to start out by providing a little bit of contextual information, and then talk a little bit about what very long actual history of family separations research can tell us about these kinds of situations in terms of the impact both on kids and adults in the short term and long term. And then we want to connect that back to some data for the state of Nebraska and really sort of make this issue of what's happening at the border local and talk to you about why some of these same stressors, some of these same traumas that are taking place at the southern border are also some of the same issues that children and families are dealing with throughout the state of Nebraska, with all the uncertainty, even if they're U.S. citizens, if their parents are undocumented, why they live with some of those same stressors too, and that constant concern about family separation. So even though we're sort of largely, the impetus for this was everything that was taking place at the border, we really want to try to connect it back to Nebraska as much as possible. And then at the end, we really want to try to have a nice discussion with all of you about these stories, about the impact on kids, what it means for our communities, and where we go moving forward. But we don't envision that as sort of a traditional Q&A with the people who are presenting, but rather a dialogue among all of us that are present here. And Christian has been kind enough to volunteer to join us at that time and help moderate that discussion among all of us that are present here. So thanks again, we do appreciate it. I think for anybody who's seen some of the coverage or read some of the articles about these stories, these heartbreaking stories, it's tough not to be impacted by them. We were talking on the way here that we all have kids, and that even conversations with kids about these situations and what they see or what they may have been hearing about, maybe from some of their classmates, has impacted them as well. They're very much aware of all of these news stories. But this was really sort of brought home to me a few years back, actually, when with some other colleagues from OLLAS, we started to volunteer and implement a project at the Douglas County Detention Center, working with some of the ICE detainees, both adult males and females. And we were doing a number of different things with them, but to try to make their experience a little bit better, if we can say that. But what I was really interested in was, because they had been separated from, many of them had kids, many of them young kids, for weeks, if not months, was allow a bridge for them to reconnect with their kids, for their kids to hear their voices. And so we provided opportunities for these individuals to read. We recorded them reading children's books, and we allowed them to write messages on the books. And then we sent those recordings and the books to the children, so that in the evening or whenever they were just really missing their mom or their dad, they would have that opportunity to play that recording, to hear their voice, and feel just a little bit closer to them. And I will probably, for as long as I live, I will never forget those experiences with them, because of how emotional it was for both the moms. And actually the dads are the ones, I'm a dad, so the dads really stood out to me. How emotional it was for them to read these stories, to send messages to the kids. And so when all of this started happening at the border, it really hit close to home for me, and it was one of the first things I thought of, was those experiences that I had with those folks in the detention center. Okay, I'd like to start with just a little bit of data to sort of set the stage for where we're at. If you hear some of the talking heads on TV or read some of these reports that don't provide a good context, you can really maybe come to the conclusion that as a country we're facing this extreme national crisis with respect to individuals trying to cross over the border. And what this data shows is that, in fact, what we've seen since 2000 is a precipitous drop over those years through 2018 in the number of migrants that are apprehended on the U.S.-Mexico border. And so while it certainly is a security issue for any country with respect to individuals who are crossing borders, and it's obviously a humanitarian issue for those migrants who are making those journeys, it's important to realize that, in fact, we've seen these big drops with respect to the number of folks that have been apprehended at the border by year. I don't have it on this graph, but if you look in recent years at the amount of resources that have been dedicated at the border for border patrol agents, you actually see sort of the inverse, that the number of border agents actually increases as the number of migrants apprehended at the border decreases. This is not, tonight's not about politics per se, but I think it is an important conversation that needs to be had at the national level about, and obviously it's in the news now, right? So we've got threats of shutting down the government again, and immigration is front and center. So these kinds of figures, I think, need to be kept in mind. Now, apart from the drop in the number of people crossing the border, there was an important shift in recent years in their makeup that sort of precipitated these changes in policy. So if you look at the year 2012, and I don't know, for those of you who are back, I apologize if you can't read those numbers, but I'll just sort of highlight some of the figures. In 2012, 90% of the individuals or the folks apprehended at the border were single adults, men and women, okay? And only 3% were family units. In fact, back in 2012, there was twice the number of unaccompanied children apprehended at the border than we saw family units coming and trying to cross the border together. In 2018, just 6 years later, the number of border apprehensions for family units rose from 3% in 2012 to 35% in 2018. And 12%, that number grew a little bit, were unaccompanied children, okay? So part of the reason why there's been all this talk about trying to create policy that might lead to, or at least might try to make families think twice about making the journey to the United States, is driven by these numbers, that if you're going to be coming as a family unit and you risk family separation, that you would think twice. And so it's been used as a point of deterrent. Trump has said it, other officials have said it as well, that because of this change, not just the drop, but because of the increase in the number of individuals coming over as family units, that's part of the reason why these family separations, that was part of the impetus for that. And so let me just give a little bit more background information on the zero tolerance policy for criminal illegal entry. This was a policy that was announced on April 6th of last year by the Department of Homeland Security and ICE by extension, where they announced this policy of separating families that were apprehended at the border. And as I mentioned, the Trump administration has argued that these family separations are a tool for deterring other migrant families for coming to the United States. Obviously, it was very contentious policy. There was a lot of pushback from members of Congress, a lot of pushback from the American people. And in part as a response to that, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, had this quote on their website, that the DHS doesn't have a blanket policy of separating families at the border, that families are intentionally split up only if a child is determined to be at risk, or if a child's parent or legal guardian is referred for criminal prosecution. What they conveniently don't mention is the fact that under the Justice Department's new zero tolerance policy as implemented, all adults that are found to be crossing the U.S.-Mexico border without authorization are actually now priorities for criminal prosecution. So all of those individuals, regardless of what this quote is saying, all of those individuals would therefore be at risk for having their children taken away. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning here, when this news first started breaking, They talked about the number of family separations that were taking place as a result of these apprehensions. And the number that was thrown out in a lot of the news reports was that it was affecting or impacting 2,500 families. This past week, actually as part of a New York Times investigation, new reports came out indicating that the number of family separations is probably closer to double that. It's probably closer to 5,000 because family separations were occurring at the border as early as the summer of 2017. So a full 9 months or so before they actually implemented the zero tolerance policy, they were already regularly separating families that were apprehended at the border trying to cross. The truth is that unfortunately, and much has been said about this, the government has as much admitted that they have poor or inaccurate data on the family separations, who was sent where, what happens to kids that were taken by family members in the States when parents were deported. All of those records are very, very poor, and so the probability is that we're never going to know the exact number of families that were affected by this policy and these changes. But at the moment, the closest estimate that seems to be available is that it's about 5,000 families. The zero tolerance policy has been widely denounced when it was made public. I'm not going to go through this slide. You guys have probably seen it in news reports as well, but all of the major professional societies and organizations that have to do with psychological and physical health have all widely denounced the policy because of the data that exists that we'll talk about in a little bit, showing both short and long-term impacts on children and families, even if there is reunification. Before I turn things over to Dr. Santo, I just wanted to finish the initial part of my presentation by just making sure that when we think about where these children, where these families are with respect to their physical and psychological well-being, it's not enough for us to just think about the kinds of things that we're reading about with respect to these family separations, with respect to the conditions that those children and parents face as they're awaiting hearings or awaiting deportation. You really have to remember that the stress and the trauma that impacts their physical and psychological well-being actually begins before they actually migrated. So we're talking about individuals and families that are coming largely from Mexico and Central America, who are facing situations that are very dire, where there is a lot of violence being witnessed by families and by children, where families are essentially being threatened by some of the gangs in the area, saying you have 24 hours to turn over your son or your daughter. That sometimes is the impetus for these movements that we see. So we can't just think about what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. It's about the things that they've been experiencing all along the way. And I would include the movement phase as well, because that is a very stressful journey that these families and these children, some as young as just a few months of age, are making. A lot of them are walking a big chunk of these hundreds, if not thousands, of miles. They're doing it with not the greatest access to appropriate nutrition, clothing, and so it's a very difficult journey. It would be a very difficult journey for any one of us even coming from backgrounds that are different from the kinds of life experiences that they're having. So I don't want to really sort of make too much of this, but I just want us to understand that at the point where these family separations are happening, they're not in the best position to deal with these really significant traumas, both from a physical standpoint as well as a psychological standpoint. And so with that in mind, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Santo.
Thank you so much, Juan. So even though these issues are being discussed relatively recently in light of the zero tolerance policy that was enacted last year, the evidence of the consequences and the harmful effects of these family separations have been well established in research going as far back as World War II. In terms of researchers have looked at the consequences on children, have looked at the consequences these have on the parents and on the communities as a whole, and the findings are relatively consistent. This is a pervasive issue that you can observe measurable deficits in a number of different ways. With that having been said, there's not a lot of research as to what's going on right now necessarily, but there is a wealth of research in terms of the effects of family separation through deportation taking place here in the US. And so a lot of the research tends to mirror those exact same effects, and so we can apply a lot of what we know about family separations as a result of deportation to the consequences that we're seeing here today. So with that having been said, some of my research is focused on trying to sort of understand the consequences of stressful experiences, and specifically in children. And one of the things that we see over and over again is the degree to which these stressful experiences have cascading effects that can be measured physically in terms of overall health, in mental health, and in all the types of interactions between children and their peers, children and their parents, and in communities as a whole. So to give you an example, one just directly observable example is that children require their parents to regulate their own emotions. 4- and 5-year-olds need their parents' help even just identifying what emotions to feel in response to normal events that they encounter on a day-to-day basis. To imagine what it would be like for these kids to be experiencing the type of stress that these family separations and deportations cause, where the best person to mitigate that stress and to help manage that stress for those children would be the person that is being taken away from them, highlights just not only how stressful this situation is, but really you're taking a bad situation and making it even worse. And the consequences of this research highlight that this impacts overall physical health, but also mental health as well for these children in terms of as measured by symptoms of depression, anxiety, and we can also see this in terms of their overall activity in a number of areas, specifically cognitive ability as well. These kids aren't able to learn as well because of the stress impacting almost every area of their overall development. And also, so having said that, the research is relatively consistent that what we're looking at is consequences related to anxiety, consequences related to depression, and that these effects are observable in a variety of different areas. So you can see this in terms of their sleeping abilities, you can see this in terms of these kids are having difficulty even engaging in eating, healthy eating. And so for us, our concern is that we're seeing impact of anxiety, like the fear of having a parent possibly deported, exacerbated by the possibility and the actual eventuality of a parent being deported, all leading to stressful and activity of the body's natural stress response taken to increased heights. And so these effects are measurable in the short term, but also simultaneously in the long term. So you can see this in terms of increased symptoms of withdrawal, symptoms of isolation. We see this, as I mentioned before, in symptoms of anger and depression. But you can also look at the consequences of these effects 10 and 20 years down the road, in which we see higher instances of post-traumatic stress disorder. We also see poor overall identity formation in adolescence, in adulthood. We also see examples of these children having difficulty forming lasting relationships for the simple fact that they've lost many of the best examples and models for developing lasting relationships. And we also see distrust in authority figures and difficulties academically or also behaviorally. So the research is relatively consistent that these effects and consequences are dire for children. There's less evidence, but the evidence is also rather clear that these consequences also bleed into the parents as well. Largely that the parents who are dealing with these family separations are equally suffering from anxiety and depression. And the consequences are also such that these impact children and families, in some cases, who are US citizens, and it's important to me, I think, that we keep that in mind. So what we're talking about here is higher likelihood of children growing up in single-parent households as a result of these separations and deportations. And an issue that's also illustrated a lot is the way in which this impacts the parent-child relationship. These children have essentially been separated from their parents, who had no ability to mitigate this, who had no control over making this happen. And even when they are eventually reunited, you see a deficit in terms of their overall relationship, and that these kids have lost trust in the relationship and the trust they have with their parents, even though those factors were completely outside of their control. There's also some findings highlighting that this impacts other family relatives beyond parents, like relatives, grandparents, in that now they are more often having to take other responsibilities that impacts whether or not they can work, and also just has impacts on communities as a whole. So this is why I'm familiar with the effects on children and parents. This is a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but again, the research is rather consistent that you can even measure these effects in communities. Immigrants and these parents are buying houses, are buying cars, are in fact involved in their communities, and these deportations are having an effect on essentially harming the overall community as a whole. And some examples include, following an ICE raid, we see decreases in attendance in churches, decrease in attendance in school. US citizen children aren't attending school as much following an ICE raid. And we also see decreases in children's access to food assistance, even though these are services that they are completely eligible for and would benefit from following an ICE raid for fear of being targeted or being identified by the government. So all of these effects are observable in terms of the individual, the family, and the community as a whole. And the research is really consistent that these cause long-lasting deficits that go on to impact these children and their parents and communities for years to come. And Lissette has a little more about how this relates to Nebraskans.
Yes. I am a social demographer, so my presentation is heavy with the numbers. But I wanted to actually also point out that most of the studies in sociology that talk about community effects have been done using convenience sample. Basically, they have used service providers that may have already a trust relationship with people that have been affected by this type of issues, deportation, and they have follow up with them, what are the consequences. So my task today in this part of the presentation is to show you the effects on the community in Nebraska, but using the census data. So it's not, I'm not using the service provider data, that's haven't been done as far as I know. But I think like the numbers also speak by themselves when you follow up what is going on in terms of the immigrant community in Nebraska. Okay? So I want to start by reminding, something that actually when we talk about immigrants, we need to remind ourselves, I guess, that the US is a country of immigrants. So if you see, I made this graph about children of immigrants in the state back since the first census in the 1870, and you see that the immigrant children in Nebraska contributed a lot to the population, And at peak year, they account for 42% of the children population of children in the state. And even back then, you know, Nebraska is not new to immigration or migration. Even back then, Nebraska had not been isolated from the effects of anti-immigrant policy. And we can remind ourselves that actually there was a Mexican Repatriation Act, very early, 1929 to 1937. And even though the Mexican community was almost unreadable in the numbers, in the vast numbers of immigrants that were part of Nebraska, they were targeted by immigration authorities. There is a few accounts, numeric accounts of what happened. Actually, nationwide, we know that there were 2 million people that were repatriated, and 2/3 of that people were actually US-born citizens, you know, children. In Nebraska, it's difficult to follow up, not only